everybody, and welcome to Ancient Insights. Please subscribe now to get the latest ancient history news, archaeology, and other interesting research around the world. Prior to the 19th century CE, plague was thought to be supernatural in origin, a punishment from the gods or God, and the result of a population sin. From the plague of Athens to the Black Death and the Columbian exchange epidemics, here we take a look at the major recorded plagues of the ancient and medieval era. The word plague as related to lethal epidemic was coined by the physician Galen, who lived through the Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 or 190 CE. But the disease was recorded long before in relating to the affliction of the plague of Athens, which occurred between 429 to 426 BCE. And killed many of the city's inhabitants, including the statesman Pericles. Plagues certainly may have existed prior to the Athenian outbreak, and almost certainly did, but most studies of the epidemic began with Athens, as it is the first to be recorded by an eyewitness and survivor, the historian Thucydides. Plagues are routinely named either for the person who reported them, the monarch at the time of the outbreak, the region afflicted, or by an epithet, as in the case of the Black Death. The Plague of Athens. The Plague of Athens arrived through the port of Piraeus, probably in 430 BC, and erupted across the city in 429 BC. Thucydides wrote, "It is said to have broken out previously in many other places, in the region of Lemnos and elsewhere, but there was no previous record of so great a pestilence and the destruction of human life. The doctors were unable to cope, since they were treating the disease for the first time and in ignorance. Indeed, the more they came into contact with sufferers, the more liable they were to lose their own lives." Athens had been engaged in the Second Peloponnesian War against Sparta. The general and statesman Pericles had recently ordered a retreat behind Athens' walls. The close quarters of the now inflicted population meant that once the plague entered the city, there was no room for quarantine of the sick. The disease therefore spread quickly. The symptoms included a fever, sneezing, sore throat, extremely bad breath, violent coughing, chest pains, insomnia, and convulsion. Many people were in good health when the plague struck, but they succumbed within 10 days after the first symptom of the fever. This fever persisted throughout at such a degree that people could not tolerate clothing and were constantly in need of water, which the body could not hold down. Those who tried to help died so quickly that others began abandoning the ill and looking after their own interests. Thucydides described a complete breakdown of law and abandonment of religious practices. No one was willing to persevere in struggling for what was considered an honorable result, since he could not be sure that he would not perish before he achieved it. What was pleasant in the short term and what was in any way conducive to that seemed to be accepted as honorable and useful. No fear of the gods or law of men had any restraining power. Even so, those who survived the disease and found they were now immune devoted themselves to helping others still afflicted. The plague killed many of the most prominent citizens, Pericles among them, and affected the outcome of the war. With so many dead and the city significantly weakened, Athens struggled to maintain the war effort and eventually lost to Sparta. The death toll from this epidemic was put at 75 to 100,000. The Antonine Plague. The Antonine Plague devastated the Roman Empire under the co-rule of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, and it was named after Aurelius' family name, Antonius. It first appeared in Roman army during the siege of the city of Seleucia in the winter of 165 to 166 CE, and was spread by these troops returning to Rome or as they were stationed elsewhere. Symptoms as described by Galen began with fever and included diarrhea, outbreaks on the skin, pharyngitis, which is the inability to swallow, accompanying a sore and swollen throat, unbearable thirst, coughing and vomiting. Those who caught the disease either died or recovered within 2 weeks. The plague is thought by modern scholars to have originated in China and spread westward along the Silk Road, as the cities of Ctesiphon and Seleucia were important trade links with direct access to Chinese suppliers. People of the time, however, interpreted the epidemic as a punishment for sin, with various stories circulating assigning blame. According to the historian Cassius Dio, the disease took the lives of upwards of 2,000 people a day and took both Lucius Verus in 169 CE and Aurelius in 180 CE. Aurelius had blamed the Christians for the plague, claiming they had angered the gods by refusing to participate in the state religion and persecuted them. The Christians, however, became the primary caregivers at this time, nursing the afflicted without regards for their own safety. As a result, more people converted to Christianity. The Antonine Plague has routinely been cited as the beginning of the destabilization of the Roman Empire. Whether one accepts this claim, it can be argued that the plague completely changed the dynamics of Roman society. The army was weakened by the immense loss of troops, and new recruits from among Germanic tribes did not have the same level of loyalty. Gladiators died as easily as anyone else, and there were fewer games, resulting in public unrest, which, coupled with the people's abandonment of traditional religious practices in favor of Christianity, broke social cohesion. Farmers were unable to produce crops, artisans were no longer alive to make crafts, and so many people died that the economy came close to failing. The death toll was put at about 5 million people. The Plague of Cyprian. The Plague of Cyprian, death toll put at 5,000 people per day, takes its name from Saint Cyprian, the cleric who recorded it. Unlike Galen, Cyprian was not a doctor, but still presents a vivid image of the progress of the disease and its effects. The first symptom, as with the earlier epidemic, was fever, which was followed by general weakness and fatigue, sore and swollen throat, hearing loss, diarrhea, vomiting, and possibly eye infection. Modern-day scholars have suggested the epidemic may have been bubonic plague, cholera, or typhus, but could also have been smallpox. This outbreak is also thought to have originated in China and traveled along the Silk Road to Alexandria and then on to Rome. It struck at a time when the Roman Empire was already weakened. During the crisis of the 3rd century, when there was no strong central leadership and barracks emperors rose to power on the strength of their ties to the military and fell quickly when they could not deliver on their promises. Record keeping at this time was therefore poorly maintained generally, and there is no official death toll for the plague outside of the generally accepted number of 5,000 people a day, derived from scattered reports of the time and that of Cyprian. As with the Antonine Plague, Christians became the central caregivers, which strengthened the religion further. The emperors Justinian and Claudius Gothicus both died, as well as many of the pagan clergy, which left predominantly Christian clerics to explain the cause of the disease in Christian terms. The plague further weakened the Roman army and economy, as more soldiers were lost than in the Antonine Plague, and the death of farmers left crops to rot in the field. The Plague of Justinian. Although the dates of the Plague of Justinian were routinely given as 541 and 542 CE, considered the worst phase, the epidemic continued long afterwards, finally vanishing at 750 CE. It is the first fully documented case of the plague as caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis in the world. The plague takes its name from the monarch of the Byzantine Empire, Justinian I, and was first recorded by the historian Procopius, who chronicled many of the events of Justinian I's reign. This plague, considered the most devastating up to that time, is also thought to have originated in China and traveled to India via the Silk Route and then on to the west. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, was another city like Seleucia and Ctesiphon, which served as a major trade center and conduit between the east and west. Procopius reports unusual cold weather which blighted crops and drove people from rural regions towards cities like Constantinople seeking shelter and assistance. With these people came the rats, who found shelter in carts of supplies. People first experienced fever and fatigue before swelling of bubbles broke out around their ears, in their armpit and groin. Procopius reports people becoming delusional before falling into comas and dying within a week of contracting the infection. The cause of the plague, according to Procopius, was Justinian I's misguided reign, which God was now punishing him and his people for. Justinian I did fall ill but recovered, while many others did not. Modern-day scholars believe that along with transmission along the Silk Road, the plague was spread by the supply trains of Justinian I's army, which carried infected rats back to Constantinople. The people of the time, however, had no idea of the cause and so no concept of how to treat the plague, relying mainly on prayers and protective amulets. The only effective action which slowed the spread of the disease was quarantine of the sick and what is known today as social distancing. The empire survived the plague, but in a greatly diminished form, having lost approximately 25% of its population. The Roman Plague. The Roman Plague, with no statistics on death toll available, was a continuation of the plague of Justinian, but localized at Rome. Like Justinian's plague, it seemed to have been a combination of bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague, with the bubonic strain most prevalent. This epidemic was also interpreted as a punishment from God, and the Pope Gregory I decreed it could only be stopped by penitential procession through the city, begging for mercy through the intercession of the Virgin Mary. These processions brought a significant number of people in contact regularly, spreading the infection, and report of the time described people collapsing and dying as they participated. Even so, the processions continued, and when the plague ended, they seem to have been credited with appeasing God's wrath. The Near East Plague. The plague of the Near East are usually summarized in discussions of the plague of Shero, which killed the Sasanian monarch Kavad II, whose birth name was Shero. The plague had been present in the region over 100 years earlier, however, and is thought to be a continuation of the plague of Justinian. When it began in 562 CE, the death toll in the city of Amida was given at 30,000, and the outbreak of 688 and 689 CE claimed about 200,000 lives in Basra in 3 days. The plague came in phases, some worse than others, and was again attributed to God's anger over humanity's sins. Whatever courses of action people took is unknown because there are so few sources extant. Scholar Peter Christensen wrote, "We have very little detailed information of the cause of the pandemic in the region. Few contemporary accounts have survived." In the 9th century, when the plague had finally disappeared, scholars in Basra wrote brief summaries of the history of the disease. Though considered highly authoritative by later Muslim historians, these books of plague are in fact incomplete. It is for this reason that historians usually focus only on the plague of Shero, because its effects, at least, are the best documented. Kavak II began his reign by having his brother, step-brother, and half-brothers murdered, so they could not challenge his claim to the throne. After eliminating every legitimate successor, he reigned only a few months before dying of the plague. The only person left who could succeed him was his 7-year-old son, Ardashir III, who was controlled by a regent and quickly overthrown, setting in motion the instability which contributed to the collapse of the Sasanian Empire. The Black Death. The Black Death is the best-known plague in history, killing between 30 to 50% of the population of Europe. Although this epidemic has been identified as bubonic plague, the other two types were also present. As with the earliest outbreak, symptoms began with a fever, body aches and fatigue, before buboes appeared on the body, in the groin, armpits, and around the ears. The black buboes give the plague its name. People usually died within 3 days of infection. This plague is also thought to have originated in Asia and arrived in Europe, most likely through Sicily via Genoese trading ships coming from the east which were infected with rats and their fleas. Although historians also cite the Silk Road land route as a probable source of transmission, the Genoese ships are the most likely source, as it is documented that one of these docked in Marseille and Valencia, spreading the disease to both. Within 2 years, Britain, France and Spain were reeling under the plague, and trade then carried it further to Ireland. By about 1350 CE, it has spread to Germany, then Scandinavia, into Russia. This plague was also attributed to God's wrath, the devil, and the sinfulness of humanity, and treatment was centered on religious rites and observance. Certain marginalized groups were also blamed, and pogroms among the Jews increased. In the port of Rugasa, modern-day Dubrovnik, however, which was controlled by Venice, authorities took another and far more effective approach. They instituted a law establishing a 30-day isolation period for ships arriving from areas affected by plague, which was known as the Trentino. Rugasa had been severely struck by the plague in 1348 CE and seemed to have been the first to institute measures to stop its spread. This practice would eventually be adopted by other cities in different countries, who expanded it from ships to towns and cities, and extended the period to 40 days under the law of Quarantino, which provides the roots for the English word quarantine. Anyone breaking quarantine could be fined and were then placed in further isolation, but the wealthy could always buy their way out, and others simply ignore the policy, and so the disease continued to be spread by those who would not abide by the law and remain in seclusion. The consequences of the epidemic were far-reaching in that it almost completely transformed medieval European society. The feudal system and institution of serfdom, which tied the working poor to the land of the wealthy lord, could no longer be maintained, because so many people had died that those who could still work demanded greater autonomy and payment. Women's rights improved, since many had lost their land-owning husbands and sons and were allowed to retain control of the properties and businesses. A notable consequence was a shift in focus from God and heaven to humanity and life on earth, which would eventually give rise to the Renaissance. The death toll is estimated at 30 million people. The Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is the modern-day term for the transference of culture, people, and technology between Europe and the so-called New World, following Christopher Columbus' expedition of 1490 CE. The exchange also brought the smallpox epidemic and other diseases which killed between 80 to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas, who had no immunity against European diseases. The epidemics which swept through the populace in 1520 CE and began between 1545 to 1548 CE, emptied towns, villages and cities, and contributed to the fall of the Aztec and Inca empires. Along with smallpox, the Europeans also brought typhus, measles, yellow fever, and possibly syphilis. This disease, along with military campaigns carried out against the Native Americans by Europeans looking to control land and resources, severely impacted Native American culture. The population of certain tribes and regions was reduced so heavily that colonization was made easier and Europeans came to control the land previously inhabited by the natives. Plagues continued to destabilize and reduce population into the modern day. The worst of this was the influenza outbreak of 1918 CE, also known as the Spanish flu, so called because it was first reported by Spain. The death toll is estimated at between 50 to 100 million worldwide, making it the worst or deadliest plague in world history. Various theories have been proposed as to its source, but it seemed to have originated in an army camp in Kansas, United States, and spread by troops deployed for World War I, who landed in Brest, in France. Other epidemics followed throughout the 20th century CE, a notable example being the HIV/AIDS infection, which has killed about 35 million people since it was first identified in the mid-1980s CE. These two outbreaks have one underlying characteristics in common: the failure of the population to appreciate the seriousness of the disease until it was too late, and the failure of government to respond to it in a timely fashion. Prior to the recognition of germ theory, it is understandable that people would interpret the plague in terms of the prevailing religious ideology. But in the modern era, the failure of governments and population to respond quickly with practical measures remains bewildering. After the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918 CE, the effectiveness of quarantine was fully recognized. Those cities which enacted lockdowns effectively stopped the spread of the disease. Even so, by the time they acted, more people had been infected and more had died, while more had helped to spread the disease by ignoring the governmental policies on social distancing, a paradigm unfortunately still present with the COVID-19 pandemic. If you find this video interesting and want to learn more about our ancient past, kindly click on the playlist displayed here for more videos. Don't forget to subscribe and enable all notifications so that you will be notified when we post new videos. Like, share and engage with us in comments. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.